The evening began with a shock that ran through me, sending a chill through my entire body. We had just gotten back from a laid-back dinner at our favorite bistro when my husband, out of nowhere, gently yet firmly grabbed my arm and locked eyes with me in a way I hadn't seen in years. My heart raced, wondering if this was about something serious, something important that he hadn't been able to say in public. "Hey," he started, his voice unusually quiet and hesitant. "I've been thinking about something different for a while. Something we could try." I was about to laugh it off, assuming he was going to suggest some new travel adventure or a quirky home project, but then he said something that stopped me cold. "How about we invite Ethan and Lucas over this weekend for something a little different?" I stared at him, blinking, the world around me blurring for a moment as I tried to make sense of what he meant. Ethan and Lucas had been his closest friends since college. They'd been part of every major moment in our lives, big or small, from the beginning. They felt like family. We'd had them over countless times, but there was something about this suggestion that felt off, like it carried an entirely different meaning. It felt like stepping out onto a ledge. "What do you mean, different?" I asked slowly, half laughing, hoping I'd misunderstood. But his gaze didn't waver. "I mean, let's just have a good time.
No limits, no expectations."
He paused, his eyes locked on mine. "Let's explore something new." He said it so casually, as if it was just a fun, harmless idea. But there was a weight to his words that couldn't be ignored. My heart pounded as I processed what he was saying, a mix of emotions running through me.
Surprise.
Curiosity. Fear. There was something unsettling about the way he lingered on those words, like he'd rehearsed this moment over and over. I forced a smile and nodded, not wanting to show how rattled I felt, but inside I was a storm of questions. Why now? And why with them? This wasn't the man I thought I knew so well. By the time we walked inside, my mind was racing, trying to decode what he'd said. But he didn't bring it up again. Instead, he kissed me lightly on the forehead, a gesture that felt oddly comforting and foreign at the same time, and whispered, "Let's not overthink this." I watched him head to the bedroom, leaving me standing in the quiet hallway, alone. The silence in our home suddenly felt overwhelming. When Ethan and Lucas showed up that Friday night, they arrived exactly on time. Both of them, with their usual easy smiles, brought wine and laughter, filling the room with a sense of familiarity, almost too familiar, as if we'd rehearsed it all before. I found myself studying them, wondering if they knew about the conversation my husband and I had just had, or if I was the only one still overthinking everything. We decided to have dinner on the roof of our building, overlooking the city. The evening was perfect for it. The sky was clear, a light breeze in the air, and the distant hum of the city added to the atmosphere. We set the table together, passing plates and glasses a little closer than usual, maybe a little more deliberate in how we moved. As Ethan handed me a glass of wine, his hand brushed against mine and lingered just a moment too long. I smiled, brushing it off, but my heart skipped a beat. There was a strange tension building between us, something unspoken hanging in the air as we ate. My husband was in high spirits, his laughter louder than usual, filling the night. He seemed relaxed, happy, as though he had been anticipating this moment. Ethan and Lucas played along, laughing at his jokes and stories with the same enthusiasm. But every so often, I caught one of them glancing at me, their eyes briefly betraying something I couldn't place. After a while, my husband excused himself to grab another bottle of wine we'd forgotten to bring up. I watched him disappear down the stairs, leaving me alone with Ethan and Lucas. They both seemed to notice his absence at the same time, and a silence settled over us. The easy flow of conversation from earlier was gone, replaced by something tense and electric. I felt their eyes on me, and suddenly I was hyper-aware of every little thing I did. Adjusting my hair, the way I held my glass. Out of nowhere, Ethan leaned in closer, his voice soft, almost uncertain. "Are you okay? You seem different tonight." I laughed, though it came out strained. "Oh, just a little tired, I guess." But Ethan didn't pull away. His expression softened, and there was an earnestness in his eyes. "You don't have to pretend," he murmured, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear. It was such a simple gesture, but the moment his fingers brushed my skin, something inside me shifted. I couldn't tear my gaze away, not until I fully understood what was happening. He leaned in, his lips brushing mine, gentle and tentative, almost as if testing the waters. In that moment I froze, caught in a whirlwind of emotions. Shock, uncertainty, and an undeniable thrill of something forbidden. I didn't pull away, and that small choice felt monumental, like crossing an invisible line I hadn't even known was there until that instant. The moment shattered when footsteps echoed in the hallway. My heart raced as I jerked back, just as my husband appeared, bottle in hand, completely unaware of what had just happened. Ethan and Lucas returned to their seats, and we all pretended nothing had changed. My husband sat beside me again, his hand resting on my shoulder, but I barely heard what he was saying. My mind was spinning, but I forced a smile, nodding along to his stories, praying he wouldn't hear the quiver in my voice. But deep down, I knew everything had shifted in ways I couldn't undo. As we went back inside the apartment, my thoughts were still tangled from the night on the rooftop, the echoes of what had occurred lingering in my mind in ways I couldn't quite make sense of. My husband, oblivious, seemed intent on keeping the evening going smoothly. He had that mischievous look in his eyes, the same one he wore during his more playful moments, though now it felt completely out of place given everything that had happened. "How about we do something fun?" he asked, glancing around the room with a spark in his eye. I smiled, but it was half-hearted, still reeling from what had happened with Ethan. "Isn't dinner and drinks enough?" I asked, trying to laugh, but my voice came out thin, even to my own ears. "Oh, come on," he replied, nudging my shoulder playfully. "We haven't had a proper game night in forever. Besides, what better way to wrap up the night than with a little friendly competition?" His grin was contagious, and even though all I wanted was to retreat into the quiet of our bedroom, his enthusiasm made it hard to say no. Ethan and Lucas, already moving to clear the table, seemed just as eager. I tried to give him an out, hoping he'd notice my hesitation. "I'm not sure I'm up for it," I murmured, but he simply took my hand, squeezing it in his, and gave me that look, the one that never failed to get to me. "Please?" he asked, his voice soft, his expression pleading. I sighed, realizing he wasn't going to let it go. With a reluctant nod, I agreed. Fine. Just for a little while. Within minutes, we were all gathered around our old coffee table. The room was dimly lit, with shadows stretching across the walls, creating an almost surreal atmosphere. I was hyper-aware of every movement, every glance exchanged between us. Lucas handed out the game pieces and explained the rules as we all settled into our places. I couldn't shake the unease that lingered from what had happened on the roof, and how easily we all seemed to ignore it, pretending everything was normal. The game began innocently enough. My husband cracked jokes and laughed as we moved our pieces around the board, his energy contagious. He watched us with a proud smile, like he was the mastermind behind this perfect evening. For a moment, I almost allowed myself to relax, grateful for the distraction. For a brief second, I nearly forgot what had happened, almost. But as the game went on, the tone shifted. The laughter became less frequent. Our conversations grew quieter. Every now and then, Ethan or Lucas exchanged glances, as though sharing some private joke that didn't include me. At one point, I caught Lucas's gaze, and he held it just a little too long, his expression unreadable. Meanwhile, my husband remained oblivious, completely at ease, watching us all with that same spark in his eyes. He seemed unaware of the tension brewing just beneath the surface. He leaned back, casually draping an arm around my shoulders. "Having fun?" he asked, a satisfied grin spreading across his face. I nodded, offering a weak smile in return. "Yes, definitely." But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't entirely true. I was trying to stay present, to push the chaos inside me aside. The game continued, the pieces moving across the board like they could somehow take away the confusion that had been building all evening. But no matter how hard I tried to focus, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was teetering on the edge of something. Something familiar, yet unknown. Every now and then, I caught Ethan or Lucas looking at me, their eyes flickering with an unreadable intensity. My husband, however, seemed completely unaware, his laughter too loud for the small, dimly lit room. The game dragged on longer than I expected, and I could feel my patience wearing thin, though I didn't want to break the moment. Somehow, I knew my husband was enjoying this, relishing the togetherness, but I still didn't fully understand it. And as the night wore on, so did the tension, wrapping itself around us like the growing darkness outside. I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that this was just the beginning. By the time the game finally wound down, it was well past midnight, but the night still felt far from over. My husband leaned back, a satisfied look on his face, glancing around the room as though he'd just pulled off some grand plan. I felt drained by the strange atmosphere that had settled in, far removed from the carefree vibe we'd started with. He seemed to still be basking in it, though. Ethan and Lucas exchanged a glance, a silent communication passing between them that made me uneasy. "All right," my husband said, stretching as he stood. "I'll grab us some more wine." He flashed me a reassuring smile before heading to the kitchen, leaving me alone with his two friends once more. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. I found myself staring down at the scattered game pieces, avoiding their gazes. After a moment, Lucas cleared his throat, breaking the stillness. "Tonight's been different," he said, his tone neutral, though his eyes glinted with something I couldn't quite place. I managed a smile, though it felt forced. "Different? Good, I hope?" He smiled back, but it was Ethan who leaned forward slightly, his gaze focused, almost too intense. "Good," he echoed, his voice low. "Very good, actually." The way he looked at me made my pulse quicken, and I had to force myself to look away, gripping the edge of my chair, feeling suddenly exposed. Everything from earlier, the glances, the fleeting touches, came rushing back, leaving me feeling both exhilarated and uneasy. Just as I was about to say something, Ethan reached out, his hand brushing lightly over mine where it rested on my knee. The touch was so light, barely there, but it sent a shock through me. I looked up, meeting his gaze, and in that instant everything around us seemed to vanish. His eyes were filled with a quiet intensity that made it hard to breathe. And for a split second, I felt myself leaning toward him, drawn by something I couldn't understand. Just then I felt Lucas shift beside me, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. I was caught between them, and suddenly the space felt impossibly small, the air thick with unspoken tension. It was like the boundaries that had always been clear between us were starting to blur. And I was left stranded in unfamiliar territory. My mind screamed at me to stop, to pull away, but my body didn't seem to listen. Ethan's hand lingered on mine, warm and steady, and for a brief moment, it felt like we were the only two people in the room. I knew it was wrong, that I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But in that instant it felt impossible to resist. Just then I heard footsteps in the hallway, and I jerked back, my heart pounding as my husband reappeared with the wine bottle in hand. His face lit up with a satisfied smile, and for a brief second, I thought maybe he'd noticed something had shifted, something unspoken between us. But then he glanced around the room, his gaze passing between the three of us, and continued on as though everything was perfectly normal. He filled our glasses with wine, the action casual, unbothered. I couldn't bring myself to look at him. Guilt churned in my stomach as he settled back into his spot beside me, his hand resting on my shoulder in that familiar, easy way that suddenly felt so strange. I forced a smile, trying to pretend everything was fine, even though every nerve in my body was still humming from what had just happened. But apparently my husband wasn't done with his surprises. He leaned forward, his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "You know," he began, his voice holding something unsaid, "I've always wondered what it would be like if we were all a little closer, if we shared more with each other." His words hovered in the air, and I felt a sick twist in my stomach. Was he joking? Was he serious? I looked over at Ethan and Lucas, both of them now watching him with a mix of surprise and something else. Something darker, maybe. I opened my mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Instead, I just stared at the table, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what he was implying. It felt like he was giving us permission, inviting us to cross lines we should never even consider. The silence in the room stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable, until Ethan finally broke it. His voice was calm, but there was a new understanding in it. "You're serious, aren't you?" My husband nodded, the corners of his mouth twitching into a slight smile. "We're all adults here," he said lightly, though his gaze never left mine. "We know how to handle ourselves. Besides, what's life without a little adventure?" My heart pounded, a strange mix of curiosity and fear bubbling inside me. I didn't know how to feel. or even what I should think about all of this. For a split second, I felt as if I were standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to step forward into the unknown or pull back into the safety of what I knew. My husband's hand slipped into mine, squeezing it gently, as if trying to reassure me that everything was fine, that nothing had changed. But the truth was, I wasn't sure I could trust myself in this new reality. I glanced around the room at the faces of the people I thought I knew, and in that moment, I realized that everything had shifted. There was no going back now. The door had already opened, and whatever came next would change us all. I could feel the weight of my husband's words hanging in the air, and I knew that from here on out, nothing would ever be the same. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Conversations became disjointed, barely registering as we all slipped further into an uncomfortable silence. My husband's suggestion lingered, casting a shadow over the room, and it was as if we all knew we had crossed some unspoken line, though none of us had the courage to acknowledge it. We cleared the game pieces and collected the empty glasses, moving around the apartment with a careful, almost rehearsed precision, avoiding eye contact. My husband kept glancing at me with that small, satisfied smile, like he had orchestrated some grand plan and was waiting for our reactions. I tried to mirror his calm, but inside I was anything but. I excused myself, saying I needed some air, and stepped out onto our tiny balcony. The cool breeze hit my face, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I could breathe again. I leaned against the railing, staring at the city lights below, trying to quiet the thoughts racing through my mind. I closed my eyes, trying to ground myself in the moment. Just as I started to find a sliver of peace, I heard the sliding door behind me open. I didn't need to turn around to know it was Ethan. His footsteps were quiet, hesitant, stopping just behind me. His presence felt familiar, yet unsettling at the same time. We didn't speak for a moment, the silence stretching out between us, thick and palpable. "You look like you could use some company," he said finally, his voice soft, almost a whisper. There was a tenderness in his tone, and it made something stir inside me, a reminder of the closeness we'd shared over the years. I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything. His hand brushed against mine, a fleeting touch that sent a ripple of electricity through me. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. I looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt, of hesitation, but his expression was steady, warm. He moved a little closer, his shoulder brushing against mine, and in that moment everything else fell away. The noise of the apartment, the tension, the unspoken rules that had once kept us apart. It all seemed to fade, leaving just the two of us standing at the edge of something we couldn't name. His fingers closed around mine, tentative, gentle, and for a moment, I felt both comforted and terrified. I wanted to speak, to break the silence, but no words came. He must have sensed it, because his grip tightened just slightly, as though to reassure me. "We don't have to pretend," he murmured, his voice low. "Not tonight." I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, he leaned in. His lips brushed against mine, soft, unhurried, as though we had all the time in the world. It was different this time. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just a quiet, steady certainty that sent a surge of warmth through me. I heard laughter from the living room, faint and distant, pulling me back to reality. I pulled away, my heart racing, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened. He looked at me, his eyes filled with understanding. And in that moment I knew he felt it too, the strange mix of guilt and desire, both of us standing on the precipice of something we couldn't take back. Without a word, he stepped back, creating distance between us. The absence of his touch felt like a sudden loss, but part of me was relieved by the space. The boundaries may have blurred, but they hadn't completely disappeared. I turned back toward the apartment, the soft, familiar glow of the living room spilling out to greet me. It felt surreal after the rawness of the balcony. My husband and Lucas were laughing about something, their voices filling the space with a comfort that felt completely out of place after everything that had just unfolded. When my husband noticed me, his face broke into a smile. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice light. I nodded, forcing a smile. Just needed a breath of fresh air. My voice was steady, though my heart still raced in my chest. He patted the spot beside him, inviting me to join him, and for a second I hesitated, unsure if I could play along. But I crossed the room anyway, acutely aware of Ethan's eyes on me. I sat down, keeping my focus on my husband, doing my best to ignore the whirlwind of emotions that had begun to stir inside me. We continued to chat and laugh, pretending everything was as it always had been. But it wasn't. There was an undercurrent of tension now, a weight pressing down on us, each of us feeling it, even if we weren't ready to acknowledge it. The silence between the words was heavy, and I knew that, eventually, something would have to break. But for now, we all clung to this fragile illusion of normalcy. I caught Ethan's eye from across the room. He gave me a small, reassuring smile, as if silently telling me we were in this together, whatever it was. As the night wore on, our conversation slowed, our voices growing softer. The silence stretched out, the weight of the unspoken between us only growing heavier with each passing minute. It was in that stillness that I realized the truth. We had crossed a line. We had stepped into unknown territory, and there was no going back. What lay ahead was uncertain. But one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again. The morning came too soon. Sunlight filtered through the windows, casting soft, hazy patterns on the walls. I hadn't slept much. The events of the previous night were still fresh in my mind, pressing down on me like a physical weight I couldn't shake. My husband lay beside me, still asleep, his face relaxed in peaceful oblivion, as though nothing had changed. I watched him for a moment, feeling a mixture of affection and something darker, something that made me look away. The stillness of the morning was a sharp contrast to the tension of the night before. I quietly slipped out of bed and moved through the apartment like a shadow. The cold floor was silent beneath my feet. The apartment felt emptier than it should have, even though Ethan and Lucas were still here, asleep in the guest room. Their presence was a constant reminder of the boundaries we'd crossed, the lines we'd ignored. I found myself in the kitchen, my hands moving automatically as I brewed coffee, the familiar scent filling the air, offering a small measure of comfort. It was grounding, but I knew it wasn't enough. Nothing felt normal anymore. As the coffee brewed, the clarity started to sink in. What we had done wasn't just an impulse. It was something deeper, something that would reverberate through all of us in ways we couldn't yet fully understand. The sound of footsteps broke the silence, and I turned to find Ethan standing in the doorway. He didn't say anything at first, his expression unreadable. Neither of us spoke, as though we were both waiting for the other to break the silence, to acknowledge what had happened. But instead, Ethan walked over, poured himself a cup of coffee, and leaned against the counter. His gaze was fixed on the floor, his thoughts far away. "I didn't mean for things to get so complicated," he said, his voice barely rising above the hum of the coffee machine. I managed a shaky smile, wrapping my hands around my mug. Neither did I. We stood in silence, the weight of our unspoken thoughts heavy in the air. I wanted to ask him what he was feeling, what was going through his mind, but the words caught in my throat. I didn't know if I was ready to face the truth of it all. Finally, Ethan looked up, meeting my gaze with a quiet intensity that made my heart skip. "Do you regret it?" he asked, his voice low and hesitant, as though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. The question took me by surprise, and a pang of guilt twisted in my chest. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. Did I regret it? The logical part of me screamed that I should feel nothing but shame and remorse. But there was another part of me, a quiet, rebellious voice whispering something different, something I wasn't ready to face. Before I could respond, the door to the guest room creaked open. Lucas appeared, rubbing his eyes and blinking in the harsh morning light. He glanced between Ethan and me, his expression shifting as he took in the palpable tension in the room. There was something in his eyes, understanding maybe, or perhaps just resignation. He didn't speak. He simply poured himself a cup of coffee and joined us at the counter, the three of us standing in an uncomfortable silence. Just then my husband entered the kitchen, his face lighting up with a sleepy smile as he wrapped an arm around my shoulders. "Morning," he murmured, pressing a soft kiss to my temple. His touch was warm and comforting, but it only seemed to heighten the chaos inside me. I forced myself to smile, to lean into his embrace, but I could feel the weight of Ethan and Lucas's gaze, the unspoken tension thickening the air around us. We sat down for breakfast, the four of us crowded around the small kitchen table, pretending nothing was different. My husband filled the silence with light conversation, his laughter filling the room, but it felt almost too loud, too forced. I could see Ethan and Lucas's smiles were tight, their laughs strained. I felt like an outsider, as if I were watching a scene I didn't belong in, trapped in someone else's life. As the morning dragged on, the weight of the situation settled over me like a fog. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had crossed a line we could never uncross, that in our search for something new, we had broken something irreparably fragile. I looked around the table at the people I thought I knew so well, and I realized I didn't recognize them, or myself, anymore. Eventually, as the plates were cleared and the silence grew thicker, my husband looked at me, his gaze steady, his voice calm but with an edge that I couldn't place. "So," he said, his words hanging in the air, "what's next?" I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. The question felt like a trap, and I had no idea how to answer. I didn't know what he wanted to hear. I glanced at Ethan and Lucas, searching their faces for some kind of reassurance, but their expressions mirrored my own confusion. I don't know," I whispered, my voice barely audible. My husband's gaze hardened, and something flickered in his eyes, something I couldn't quite read. He leaned back in his chair, his jaw clenched, and for the first time, I saw the cracks in his carefully composed facade. The mask he wore slipped just enough to reveal the turmoil beneath. The silence stretched unbearable, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to escape. But I was trapped in the moment, rooted to the spot. And as I looked at each of them, my husband, Ethan, Lucas, I felt a sinking realization in my chest. There was no going back. The choices we had made, the lines we had crossed, the trust we had shattered, it was all irreversible. In that moment I realized I didn't know any of us, not really. And maybe I didn't know myself either.